The lure of free land offered by the Homestead Act of 1862 was irresistible. Homesteaders arrived on Captiva by any means possible. They came on schooners, sloops, then later steamers and paddle wheelers. The building of the Florida Southern Railway to Punta Gorda put Sanibel and Captiva on the map as one of the leading winter vegetable regions of the entire West Coast. The good soil and the rarity of frost attracted settlers from all parts of the country. In more modern times, fine climates and bountiful shelling attract winter visitors and tourists, and local businessmen were quick to accommodate. Between 1943 and 1963, many mail addresses had a two-digit number following the city name. These numbers were postal zones instituted during World War II. Zip codes went into effect in 1963. To more fully understand the history of the mail delivery to Sanibel and Captiva, you must return to the late 1800s.
Punta Gorda was the end of the railroad line. Anything that went further down to Fort Myers had to go by boat. And so they loaded the mail as well as all sorts of supplies on the boats. The Henry Plant line ran through there, and then a little bit later the Kinsey line began working that route. By water was the means of transportation.
The first mail delivery on the islands were very informal. George Madison Cooper traveled back and forth to St. James City on Pine Island and would bring the mail over to Sanibel. George would leave it on his wife's sewing machine for islanders to collect as they passed through.
The Kinseys, it was after 1898, and he put the Gladys online in 1902. They ran with the mail until 1936. It ended up sinking one night just offshore from the lighthouse. That was kind of the end of the steamboat era. They had the ferry line going at that point, and I think they decided to concentrate on that. It was taken over at that point by the Singleton brothers.
That's my father, Cleon Singleton, and that's his brother, Ray Singleton, who was the engineer. There, that's the Gulf dock. I know that, I remember going there. So that was his first dock. That's the boat they started with. That's the Rambler, much smaller, but very similar.
Ray and Cleon, the Singleton brothers took over the mail route in 1936, but the Santiva didn't really arrive on the scene until a few years later.
They had it built. My dad's family had mail boat runs up in the panhandle of Florida when my dad was a kid. My grandfather had the contract with the government, but he made his boys run it. And I guess they knew the boat builders there, and that's where they had the Santiva built. They figured, I guess, that the Rambler was not big enough.
New boat for use in run to Sanibel Captiva. Singleton brothers, who have been operating the mailboat between Fort Myers and Sanibel, St. James City, and Captiva, have decided that there is a possibility of much more business on this run and have bought a brand new 44-foot boat, diesel-powered, suitable for passengers, freight, and the mail job. The boat will go into service today. This new boat is named the Santiva.
Well, I can say at the start that there were mailboats all over the country, and there was stiff competition to get that contract. And the mailboat that serviced these outer islands actually originated in Fort Myers.
Originally the old Gulf dock, and then he came down the river all the way out to Sanibel.
Down into this deeper channel, because this dredged one didn't exist yet, and have to come down around these oyster bars and sand shoals. So if there was a little flag up the pole here at Punta Rasa, they would also stop and pick up mail there. So it's almost like a whistle stop on a railroad, and would make its way down to the Bailey store and stop there.
The mail wasn't delivered at the ferry landing. The mail was delivered up at Bailey's store. Then they would gather it from the boat in a Jeep, run it over to the post office to be distributed into the boxes.
And if he had passengers, he would let them off so they could walk over and enjoy the Sanibel Shell Beach.
And from there they would head on to St. James City and pick up mail there and also people that may have been waiting for a ride to get to Captiva, and then they would go up this channel. By the 50s, there was no longer a cause to stop at Wolfert.
Jenny Doan was the postmistress at Wolfert, and this is her and her husband Louis. There was also a store and a whole community there.
Getting into the old post office, if the tides are right, you can shortcut the sandbar and then come into the post office. And from the post office, then they would also back up and go to Palm Avenue. And the reason they stopped at Palm Avenue was they were carrying supplies.
Captiva postdoc was at the Gore Hotel, or Camp Gore as they called it. Hattie Gore was the postmistress on Captiva for like 37 years.
And then he picked up the people that he'd let off and came back up the river to St. James City and back to Fort Myers at 4 o'clock and dumped the mail bags in the back seat of his 36 Chevy and took it quick to the downtown Fort Myers post office. And then he ran around town for an hour before the stores closed to shop for the people on the islands. And he went to Franklin Hardware, he went to Miss Flossie Hill's women's store, he went to Sears and Penny's, and he would buy items that they asked for, everything from underwear to hats to hardware, and he would charge them a nickel up to a quarter for each thing he bought. And then at 5 o'clock the stores would close and he got to come home. You know, he left home at 6 in the morning and got back home after 5 in the evening, 6 days a week. For 16 years he did that. There was no such thing as being sick on the mailboat. You did it 6 days a week, no matter how you felt.
The mailboat dock in Fort Myers is just a few blocks from the train station. And so you have people coming off the train and getting right on the mailboat to come out. And that's how Ding Darling's family came out, was off the train onto the mailboat. And all in between is the commerce of Fort Myers, all the supplies you need. And there's a hotel in town just in case you missed the mailboat. So all of that is because the railroad is right there. The mailboat's right there. Again, another little hub of transportation.
They had to return by a certain time to make the connection to put it, say, on a train to take the outgoing mail.
It was only once or twice that they were ever off schedule. They were penalized 3 days' pay if they did not make the trip.
There was only 2 days missed. I remember one of them because I lived through it. The hurricane was coming and he and my Uncle Ray took the boat up the Caloosahatchee and then up Orange River and then up a creek from there, tied it out like 6 or 8 ways, and rode out the hurricane. The mailboat was safe.
It would have been very easy for a boat to run aground, and these are really skilled captains who would know how to navigate these waters in any condition of wind and tide. These entrepreneurs who had the mailboat contract eventually found out that they could earn money by running groceries and supplies out to a place like Captiva from downtown Fort Myers. And then they found out that there were people who were interested in just traveling and visiting these islands. They began with just a few benches in the interior part of the mailboat.
My dad later said that he built many a house on those 2 islands by bringing all of the building supplies one piece at a time.
People living on these outer islands would make requests for things to be purchased in Fort Myers and then brought back out. So they would diligently make their list of shopping items that they would like.
In 1952, he and my uncle no longer bid on the route, and the lads took over. They got the contract from the government, and they bought the Santiva from my dad and uncle, and they ran it until the bridge was built to Sanibel.
They sold it to Palmer Ladd, and he ran it really more as a tour. People would day trip from Fort Myers. The round trip was $3 with 30 cents tax, and it went from the yacht basin by the exhibition hall It was a grand day out on the island.
After a while, you saw seating for about 30 or 40 people on top of that. So it became a sightseeing boat as well as a mailboat.
The causeway was open in May, but he continued to run the mail on the boat until the end of December, and then he just retired. Sold the boat.
In early 1964, Captain Ray Singleton and his son, Captain Ray Jr., purchased her back from the lads, running her as a tour boat, often returning to the sands of Sanibel's East End lighthouse. The Santiva's legacy continued as a passenger boat on the Caloosahatchee for 2 more years, after which the Singletons delivered her to the Wakawatchee Marina in South Carolina, where she ran scenic cruises through local rice plantations. Her last tour of duty took her to Georgetown, South Carolina. To chronicle the Santiva's memory, the Captiva Island Historical Society has constructed an exhibit in her honor. Her memory comes to life in this interactive experience. This museum in a boat lets you climb aboard this treasure of yesteryear. All aboard the Santiva.
Sitting out here on the bank of the Caloosahatchee brings back a lot of memories. How hard my dad worked all those years plowing up and down this river. People said they could set their watch by when the Santiva went by on its way out to Santa.
The Santiva's wake still remains in the hearts and minds of those who knew her. Through the shoals of time, space, water, and tide,